How do you know if you are a smart person? Or how do you know if somebody that you know is a smart person? Do you have people that you think are particularly intelligent? Do you think that you're particularly intelligent? How do you know? Well, what about gifted programs, right? These things that are in place in the education system that apparently look at particular children that are precocious. They seem to have a very high aptitude for what the education system expects. And you can separate those children and put them into special programs that are supposed to, I guess, give them harder challenges, right? So that they can adapt to those challenges. They can be part of a different network of peers that are like them, I guess, smarter, or kids that have more aptitude and do really well. So on its face, I guess that kind of makes sense, right? You don't want to hold children back. Maybe you've been part of a gifted program yourself when you were young, right? Even into your adulthood, the notion that if I have a particular skill, I want to kind of max that out. I want to be in an environment that's going to reward my growth as an individual. So if we can detect that in children when they are young and precocious and have an aptitude that's higher than the rest of their peers, why don't we put them into a program that accelerates that and allows them to live up to their potential? Seems to kind of make sense. Well, there's an article by New York Magazine that came out recently called The Mirage of the Gifted Child. And it's kind of causing quite a bit of controversy online. And the argument in that article is essentially that gifted programs are not really worth it. If you look at the data, if you take a look at the studies that have actually tracked people, children, from entrance into gifted programs, and then you see how they turned out later in life, that it doesn't really live up to the reputation of these gifted programs, the way that they get sold to us in society. In other words, we're told gifted programs are good. If you put your kid into them, presumably they're going to turn out better. They're going to, right, again, adapt to better situations and be solving harder problems. They're going to live up to their potential and presumably go on to do great things. Become a doctor, become a lawyer, become a professor, have some sense of eminence, if you will. And this article is saying, no, that doesn't seem to really be the case if you look at the actual evidence. So that's what I want to talk about in this episode. Are gifted programs worth it? Let's talk about intelligence. Let's talk about this notion of actually measuring it. Does it make sense to extract people, particularly young people, into better, from regular social situations and networks into different, more kind of controlled and isolated environments that give them harder problems and put them with like-minded peers? Does that make sense? Is that going to improve the results? Well, I'd have to say that I, largely do agree with this New York Magazine article that it is a mirage, and because, as we'll see, if you look at the studies, it doesn't really live up to the data. But more to the point, if we just stop and have an intellectually honest conversation about what intelligence is and how it seems to work, the notion of things like IQ and things that are easily measured, gifted programs, doesn't really stand up, not only to the data that you're looking at, it doesn't really stand up to an intellectually honest account of what intelligence seems to be, how it works, how problem solving happens in society. We'll take a look at that. Okay, so first let's talk about some of the studies that this article references. There's kind of four main ones, and they kind of take a look at the people that have been in gifted programs and whether or not those turn out, whether or not they're actually good. So you've got the first study that they reference, or one of the first studies that they reference, which is Lubinsky. Okay, so there's a Lubinsky study, and they basically take a look at the children that are in these gifted programs and whether or not they achieve eminence, as they call it. And eminence is essentially defined as a position like a doctor or a lawyer, something that in society we would say, that's a pretty successful position. You probably had to be smart to achieve that position. So they took a look at that and they say, yeah, not really. The study says that if you take a look at the children that entered the gifted programs, not really to a statistically significant extent are they achieving eminence or any more than their peers did, or people that weren't part of gifted programs, right? There's another one by Hambrick, right? Another study that basically took a look at, over 30,000 elite performers, right? Again, whatever big kind of eminent type jobs, people that achieved very high status, really good jobs that you would consider a smart person that would need to do that. And then they took a look at at how they grew up and what their kind of history was and whether or not they were a part of these programs. And again, it's like, yeah, not really, right? Like if you take a look at a lot of the top performers in society, a lot of them had very gradual growth patterns. It wasn't like they were mentally super capable or showed signs of being particularly advanced mentally at a young age. They kind of came from different backgrounds and different whatever, and they just regardless of backgrounds, they just grew mentally differently. They developed at different rates. A lot of them were maybe late bloomers or slow bloomers if you were actually trying to measure it in the first place. And so there just wasn't that much difference. You look at the top performance, Hamburg study says, yeah, not much difference. And then there's you've got Steve Pfeiffer study, and they're taking a look at basically, is there a stability to childhood IQ? It's actually quite unstable, meaning that, if you try to measure the intelligence of a child, it's kind of all over the place, and you can have children with different, let's say, IQ move in and out of kind of what you would consider a high IQ bracket, or in and out of a group that you would consider gifted. So like sometimes they're there and sometimes they're not, or it comes later, kind of like the Hamburg study. Again, it's just not this idea that there are children that are particularly more precocious than other children, and that is going to predictably map to better eminence later in life is just not holding up to the data. And then there's a bunch of other studies that this New York Magazine article references, in addition to the Pfeiffer and the Hamburg and the Lubinsky studies, that again kind of just come to the same conclusion. It's not that there's absolutely no difference. Like you will see maybe certain people in the gifted group, like they do go on to do, great things, but it's a small percentage out of that entire gifted group. And it's not statistically significant or by much compared to the peers. And so all in all, the kind of take-home message here is that the gifted programs don't really seem to live up to the way that they're sold to us in society, right? Whether that's, teachers who are having that message or just the education system or whoever's pushing that. It's like it doesn't really live up. It's not that there's no difference at all, but to the extent that we should actually have these programs, across the country and in our education system, not really. It doesn't seem to live up to that. Okay, so now I don't know if you agree, if you don't agree, and people, of course, are going to get political about this, right? Like everything that I'm saying right now, you might think, well, that's like a left-wing position. No, I'm not doing right-wing or left-wing. I'm just saying, as you'll see in this episode, step back from this and let's talk about why a lot of these studies, and I'm going to bring more into this, show that, this idea of an isolated intelligence within the skull of one individual being that much different than somebody else just doesn't really live up to what we know about problem solving, what we know about intelligence, when we think about how that all works. And of course, studies that are actually trying to track people within these gifted programs. It's not that there's nothing, but there's just not enough there. The intellectually honest position here is that, yeah, I don't think we should really have gifted programs. It doesn't seem to make sense. And what I'm going to argue in this episode beyond that, because you could say, well, what's the harm? Why don't we just still if you think you notice some level of precociousness in a child, why don't you still try to give them the hardest problems you can and kind of isolate them into a group, right? It can't do no harm. I mean, maybe that's going to, and I'm going to say, actually, I think it's going to be super detrimental to do that. And that ties into a more proper definition of intelligence, a proper scientific definition of what we know about intelligence and problem solving I'm going to argue in this episode. Okay, so that's the New York Magazine article and the Mirage of the Gifted Child, and it's online. And some people are kind of going after the studies and say, well, hold on, what's the baseline? If you actually look at this, I'll talk a little bit more about that. And studies are just studies, right? Talk a bit more about that later too. I mean, it's not all statistics are settled, but there's quite a few studies there. But let's step away from the studies and let's just have this intellectually honest conversation about this notion of intelligence being, relegated to individuals as opposed to something else. And I'll tell you what I mean by that. Okay, well, first of all, it's kind of like the notion of IQ, right? And I've written quite a bit about IQ online, and if you don't know already, I'm definitely against it. But why? I mean, let's, can you blame someone for thinking that it makes sense? Well, no, not on its face, right? I mean, if first of all, if we just observe people in society, certain people are accomplishing a lot of big things and most people are kind of not, right? Like just whatever definition. I mean, obviously this depends on the definition of accomplishment and success, but let's just take the usual kind of cultural definition that we have of success, usually making a decent amount of money or becoming a prominent figure, right? In science, I don't know, in education or just academia in general, or, I don't know, becoming a doctor or a lawyer, or maybe becoming famous in some other way, a businessman, entrepreneur, right? Usually they become fairly well known in their field, and often there's a decent amount of money associated with it. They're successful. We know the everyday, right? There's other definitions of success, of course, right? Peace of mind, right? Contentment, family. But we're using the kind of cultural definition of shallow or not definition of success here. Okay. So if you look at that, you say, well, it's not everybody, right? In fact, it's kind of a small percentage of people, right? Like maybe the top 1%ers or something like that. So it's not ridiculous to say maybe there's something different about those individuals, right? Like, why is it only them? And of course, if you go into like the business section of the bookstore, and there's all kind of books written about that, try to decode, right? What makes a Warren Buffett, right? What makes an Elon Musk an Elon Musk? And they try to, okay. But so you can't blame someone for thinking that there's something different about them. And I'm not here to say that there's nothing different. Like there's no differentiating aspects of it, right? But what about the idea that it's something that you can specifically measure, like an IQ maybe, right? Like, is it smart people, right? There must be something smart they're doing. They seem to be, it can't just be random chance, can it? They're putting themselves into situations and they're kind of solving problems and they're making money and they're doing things or they're getting degrees. Okay, so maybe they have like higher IQ, right? But if you take a look at the IQ, research and science behind it, it's just fraught with it's just kind of all over the place, right? And what do I mean by that? Well, some studies, let's just take one example. Let's say, okay, you can look at studies, and IQ proponents will always say this, and it shows that IQ is highly predictive of later success, right? Like the success definition that I'm using, right? You look at the IQs of people, and then it seems very predictive of success in later life. And actually, at first blush, I would say, yeah, that's actually kind of true. Okay, well, if it's true, then doesn't that mean like IQ is a good thing? Here's the problem with that, though. This is a very circular definition of prediction. If you think about what IQ is, it comes down to a test, right, that are given to people. So what you're really testing for is the ability to take tests. Okay, if someone does well on an IQ test, they're probably pretty good at passing academic tests. Okay, well, if they're good at passing academic tests, they're probably getting high marks. If they're getting high marks, they're probably getting pretty good job opportunities. If they're getting into the job with those high marks, they're getting the good jobs. They're getting the high-paying jobs, on and on. In other words, there's actually nothing particularly surprising about saying someone that does really well at taking tests is going to make money later in life, because that's literally how our society is set up. It's a very circular argument. It's not even really prediction. Like if you look at prediction proper, the way a physicist would, the way a true scientist would, right? The social scientist's use of prediction, not all of it, but gets into a lot of trouble here because it tends to be pretty circular, particularly in this IQ space, right? IQ is not coming from physics and chemistry and biology. It's coming from the social sciences. I'm not trying to denigrate social sciences, but when you get soft, here's what it is. When you do things like social sciences, which is fine, that's actually some of the most complex phenomena of all, but then you try to be like a physicist in it, like you try to use very specific mathematics and precise definitions of things that you can actually measure, that's where the problem arises. So when you take a look at something, like if you're measuring the, electronic transitions within an atom, within a gold atom, and you're measuring something very precisely, well, it kind of makes sense, because in some sense the system is simple, right? You got electrons, you got orbitals, they're doing transitions, and I can measure that pretty precisely, and I can use a lot of nice, precise mathematics to model it. But then if you go to something like human intelligence, cognition, consciousness, which has just got nothing even remotely close to a very specific, precise definition around it, but then you act like you can measure it as though it does, it starts to bridge on something quite more pseudoscientific. It just does, because it's this misplaced concreteness that a lot of social scientists end up doing. It's not that there's anything wrong with looking at the phenomena that social scientists are looking at. I think that's worthy. I think you should think about things like intelligence and cognition and very complex phenomena like that. But when you start pretending like you're a physicist doing it, as though those things are easily measured and that you could be very mathematically precise about it, that's when it gets really goofy. So that's how I see IQ. And I think it's just, you have to admit that, right? This notion that intelligence is something that you can specifically measure. So you get into this kind of circularity with IQ. Good test takers get high marks. Well, yeah. People with high marks end up getting good jobs. Well, yeah. Good jobs end up being higher paying. Well, yeah. Therefore, if you have a high IQ, it's totally predictive of success. I mean, yeah, kind of, but it's not in a particularly useful or interesting way. It's just like, we know society is set up for test takers. right? Those people are going to do well. In other words, what's the point of even having the IQ test, right? What I'm really saying here is that the way people interpret this is that IQ has something to do with intelligence itself. Well, being a good test taker is not the same thing as being good at intelligence itself. We kind of touched on this a bit in the last episode, right? That's a proxy, and proxies have all these kind of problems with it. Listen to my last episode about this. So anyways, you get this circular arguments with IQ, and there's all kinds of other ways. You're calling it a measurement, but it's not really a measurement. If you look at the mathematics that are used, what is similar to essentially principal components analysis, this very simplistic statistical technique to try to find what they call a G factor. Now, that alone, there's nothing wrong with that, but then they point at the G factor and say, well, maybe they reify it into existence and say, well, maybe that's actually what intelligence is. And it's like, kind of, whoa. It just gets a bit goofy, okay? And I think anybody who's being intellectually honest about this should recognize that as being kind of goofy, because if you think about what intelligence is in everyday life, like if I drop you into a forest and you have to find your way out, when you interact with people and you have to solve a problem, it just blows out. It blows out way more than some simplistic, I'm going to pretend to be a physicist type sociologist that says, yeah, we can actually measure intelligence. It's just a bit goofy. It is. It doesn't, I'm not saying there's nothing there. I'm not saying that the G factor might not have something to kind of do with what we think of intelligence, right? But it's extremely culturally defined, and you can show there's all kinds of studies that do this, right? Where they're like, okay, let's say you have something on an IQ test, and you are expected to, there's 4 items, and you have to know which one's different, more different than the others of all the other 4 items, right? And so it's like got a weather vane, and it's got a telescope, and it's got 2 other things. And it turns out the weather vane is the most different. And if you're smart, you would be able to pick up on that pattern, and you'd be able to do it quickly. Well, there might be some cultural kind of tie to even knowing what a weather vane is or what it looks like, right? And you can do this for almost everything. Like if you had, questions related to sports, but it wasn't the sport that your nation has. If you had almost anything, it kind of has this assumption that you grew up in a world and you kind of know what these objects are and you've been exposed to them, or you think about them in terms of how it might be different than something else. No matter how objective you try to be, and even just the kind of enlightenment version of thinking about reality in terms of putting everything into a compartmentalized box and then making ratios out of them and being able to run calculations. And yeah, that's one way to look at reality. It's definitely not the only way. And it has its own problems and its own issues. There's all kinds of other ways to think about things and to solve problems and to make connections and analogies. What one student might look heavily distracted and not particularly good at writing tests, but they could actually be in many ways have a far greater mental capacity, if you wanted to actually try to assess it, than the person who just write tests. And if you think about test taking in general, right, it's an extremely low dimensional thing, right? It's like we're going to kind of separate ourselves from reality and create this very contrived, low-dimensional, specific way of problem solving, and then we're going to test people on that very specific way of thinking, and then we're going to call that intelligence. That's just a bit goofy. It doesn't make any sense. There's so many different ways to blend concepts, to make connections, and you see this if you take a look at the history of the Elon Musks and of the Jeff Bezos and the Buffetts and the Einsteins and whoever it is. There's so much variety to how they grew up and what they were exposed to and what they were passionate about and the way that they thought, what they were good at, what they were bad at. You just can't latch on to something that says, oh yeah, they were all totally like this. They were all really good problem solvers that had really good IQ and they all wrote tests really well and they got very high marks. It's just not true. It's just not. It's just not in the data. It's not in the history. And that doesn't mean you're not going to find some studies that do suggest that. But this is the issue with studies in general, is that a study is always a very kind of contrived, artificial laboratory setting that doesn't really exist in the real world. And if you do that and you home in on that very specific thing, you're always going to find a little statistical uptick that will kind of help make your point. Now, not to be a hypocrite, I was pointing to some of those studies, and I'm going to point to some more studies later that do kind of help define my point. I'm going to do quite a bit of them, though, to show the volume and to show that there are, statistical ways or studied ways to kind of back this up. But ultimately, at the end of the day, you have to take a look. You have to use some common sense here. And you are a human. You use intelligence all the time. You see other people doing it. You know what it's like to work in a group. You know what it's like to solve problems. Somebody comes and says, yeah, we can actually measure specifically what makes a smart person intelligent. I already know the studies aren't going to map to that data. I mean, I wouldn't take that alone. Let's look at the evidence, but you can tell that that's really, really goofy. It's way too low dimensional. It's way too isolated. It's way too refined. It just doesn't add up. Okay, so I said at the beginning, there was this article in New York Magazine, and it says the Mirage of the Gifted Child, and people are kind of getting upset, but some people obviously agree with it. They tend to get political about it. And I just want to, in this episode say, like, look, does it make sense? This notion of observing that some kids seem to be a lot better and then extracting them out and putting them in a special program with the idea, the only reason you're doing that is because you think that that's going to improve their chances. Don't limit them. Let them live up to their potential. And that's going to somehow map to better outcomes for that individual. It doesn't live up to the data. It doesn't really make sense in terms of how problem solving. It's a really goofy, reductionist, way oversimplified version of what we call intelligence. We know that. So it just doesn't seem to add up. I would say it's quite pseudoscientific to think that that's going to be the case. You're going to be able to point at some studies. You will. Okay, where, well, actually this, but again, we've got circularity problems with what they're calling prediction in the first place. We've got issues of this just abuse and overuse of Pearson's correlation, which is like high school level mathematics. It's the most convenient mathematical thing you can possibly do. It's easy to use. You got the p hacking and all. There's so many problems with it. And that's just a few little studies you can try to find little statistical upticks, and they're barely there to begin with. And you can inflate those correlations, and it just gets really problematic. The whole thing blows out. That's what I mean by blows out. Like it's not robust. It doesn't really add up. It's not robust to what we know about intelligence and problem solving and interacting and looking at the people who became famous and successful. You just can't pin it down so simplistically like that. I'm not saying there's nothing, but it's just nowhere near the way that it gets oversold. Okay. Now, so you could say, well, why does it blow out like that? Right? Because I said previously that, like, if you just look at the concept of IQ or just standardized testing in general, like, it does kind of seem to make sense, right? Like, again, like, if somebody's smart, wouldn't they just, if you ask them a bunch of questions on paper, be able to, right, answer them better? And I said, like, look, yes, there's circularity there, but this is very low dimensional and this is very culturally specific. That's just true. But beyond that, there's something wrong with the notion that intelligence is something that exists within the skull of an individual. Okay? That itself is kind of a goofy concept. And you might be saying, well, what do you mean? Like if I'm smart, isn't it because of what's inside my head? If you're smart, isn't it because of what's contained? Well, not really, actually. That's actually kind of goofy, right? If you think about it, everything an individual does is massively embedded within networks, right? Within society, within everything. There's nothing you can, if you think about the notion of an individual being smart, however you want to define that, you cannot disentangle that from a massive web of influence and motivation and causality. It's so deeply embedded and ultimately holistically connected to almost everything else that the idea that smartness exists in the head of an individual is itself quite pseudoscientific, actually. It's just not how complex systems work. The human brain is the most complex phenomenon we know of. Societies are complex. Markets are complex. It's all massively interacting. I talked about that Enlightenment way of thinking. It's obviously had a lot of benefit, in science. But the one thing that's kind of almost a bit goofy about the whole thing is the way that we create these demarcations. Right now, if you're doing physics and chemistry and to some extent biology, it makes sense. You can kind of think of things in isolation, and you can think about the causes that arise, right? But when you're talking about real reality, complexity, societies and markets and groups and cultures and the way that we are embedded, right? Like if you're using the word success, right? We're not talking about electronic transitions and gold atoms anymore, okay? If you want to do that kind of stuff, yeah, absolutely. There's the math, there's the precision. You can measure it, agreed, right? That's why there's a lot of math on physics and chemistry. Well, physics, blackboards, a lot of complication on chemistry blackboards, and even biology can get very detailed because that's the way they're looking at phenomena. But when you're talking about something like intelligence and cognition and wealth and success, that's not that world. That's a category error. You're not even in that same category anymore, right? So when you're taking a look at complex systems, the idea that everything has a role, a specific role to play, is kind of goofy, and it's just not true. Like even a cell, you can think of the organelles in a cell. You say, well, here's the mitochondria, and it's specifically related to energy production, blah, blah, blah. And here's another organelle, and everything's got a role. Well, that's kind of a story that we tell. If you take the organelle out of the cell, it has no definition anymore because its ability to do what it does is completely dependent and embedded in the matrix of all the other organelles within the cell. This is true. So we like to isolate and categorize things because that makes sense to us. But, we're not talking about cogs and pistons in a steam engine, right? We're talking about complexity, fully embedded systems. So the idea that somebody is smart just because of what's in their head is a bit goofy. Let me give you a more specific example to make sense of this, right? So we take quintessential example like Einstein, right? Because so is Einstein smart? I mean, everybody would be like, well, of course. I'm not saying he's not. Very smart individual, right? Came up with special relativity, general relativity, right? Described the photoelectric effect. The biggest name in science in the last 100 years by far, right? Einstein. Okay, so who's going to say this guy's not smart? Well, I'm not saying he's not smart. Okay, but if we have an intellectually honest conversation about what Einstein was able to do, we see that he was absolutely, ultimately embedded in a massive network of influence and contribution, to the extent that he never would have been able to make even a dent if it wasn't for that case. Okay, so let's use some examples, right? So if you think about Maxwell, right, and his equations and his theories, there is no path to special relativity without that. Does not exist, right? If you take a look at Lorentz, okay, and he really laid the majority of the mathematical framework needed for special relativity. Relativity, of course, being the theories associated with Einstein. If you take a look at Poincaré, right, and he was already understanding and communicating the principle of relativity before Einstein ever did, right? Einstein credits much of his work to the influence of Mach, for example. Mach. You have Ricci and the tensor, right, calculus, and how critical that was to the work that Einstein did. You can keep going. I mean, it's on and on. You have Riemann, right? Riemannian geometry, which is absolutely the bedrock of what we see in the geometry of general relativity. What else? You've got people coaching him, let's say, or helping him understand the specifics of some of the detailed geometry that he wasn't able to do himself that much, right? You have when Einstein was doing the Brownian motion, it relies heavily on the statistical framework that was put forward by Boltzmann. You've got Max Planck being critical to allow Einstein to do what he did, in quantum mechanics and all his quantum work, right? You even have people that he would just talk to on a regular basis, like Michele Besso, right? Who was this kind of engineer / scientist guy, Italian, and he would just be kind of like a sounding board for Einstein. There's a lot of conversation back and forth. And on and on. And those are just the science ones, right? We have no idea where all the influences and conversations and motivations and ideas and analogies and connections came from for Einstein to be able to do what he did. Now, that's not to discount that Einstein did something wonderful, the ability to bring all that type of information together in that unique way, okay? But that's the point, isn't it? So what you're calling smart in Einstein is actually fully dependent on the social network that he's embedded in, the network. Whether that's people he's actually talking to, the work that was done by other people, who could only do that because of the work from other people, who could only do that because ad infinitum, right, all the way back. The web of causal influence is essentially infinite if you really dug into it, right? There could be they're guaranteed there's all kinds of non-science, non-technical influences to Einstein as well. Clockmakers looking at clocks and looking at trains and doing his thought experiments. Where did that come from? How did he even know about thought experiment? Where did he learn to visualize things in his mind? Was that natural? Did somebody... On and on. There's just no way. You can't do it. You can't disentangle our notion of intelligence from the massive web of connectivity that exists to make it possible. You can't do it. It's so much so that the very notion that the intelligence is something that exists within an individual skull, that notion is just goofy, right? It's a false demarcation that we put forward so that we can talk about things the way we do. We have to put things into categories and into buckets. We demarcate things, but that's a vocabulary. That's a language that we use so we can create levels of abstraction, and we can, I'm talking about this, I'm talking about that. That doesn't mean it's reality, right? The reality is this massive holistically connected web of causal influence, and you can't disentangle it, okay? And that's true of anybody, right? So even the Einstein, even whatever definition, it's not something dumb like an easily measured test-taking ability that happened to be in academia or standardized testing or IQ. Even if that was like a facet of a very sliver of the truth of there, it's an absolute sliver relative to this completely non-demarcatable influential network of influence of causality that exists, because everybody is embedded in these systems. Okay, so how do we and so again, I'm going to bring up some more studies here, and you always got to be careful with studies, but there's just this wealth. I'm not making this up, right? I mean, there's a wealth of study going back decades and decades that just show that what we call intelligence in humanity is a social phenomenon, right? It's really what distinguishes us from the other animals in the animal kingdom. We say, well, it's our intelligence. It's because we're smart. Yeah, correct. But that's not a thing. It's not just the size of the brain. Like elephants have huge brains and tons of neurons, right? Dolphins, right? It's not just like a brain size thing. It's not even, the only reason we have the brain we do is because it's a social phenomenon, right? Intelligence is a social phenomenon. It allows us to communicate. We pick up on body language. We know where the eyes are moving. We use our hands. We invent things like money and the market. We do transactions. We do bartering. We do trade. It's all social, okay? That's what intelligence is. It's where it comes from. The idea that it's inside the skull of an individual doesn't make sense. All kinds of studies here, going back decades. You've got Vygotsky, right? And he's showing, that what we consider intelligence or the cognitive ability of humans is coming from the social interaction, and only later would an individual kind of internalize that to themselves, right? But that's what they're internalizing, is the stuff that you learn through the social interaction. You've got Edwin Hutchins, right, and talking about how what we call intelligence or the cognitive capacity of an individual, if you're thinking about it as an individual, is actually highly, highly distributed among the tools and the social constructs that we have, and symbols and environments and people, like people tools. It's just, it's not something isolated to an individual. You've got James Wersch saying that, again, you can't separate the notion of intelligence from the social constructs and tools that make all that possible in the first place. So all those tools that are distributed, right, from Hutchins, right, Wersch is showing that you can't separate it. Like, it doesn't make sense. Like I'm saying, the demarcation is kind of artificial, right? Who else? You got Michael Tomasello, right, saying that, so much of again, the cognitive machinery that we typically think is kind of within the skull of an individual, it actually has to do with society, networks, participation, right? It's not about the individual. You've got Barbara Rogoff, talking about how, the intelligence is about participating in the community. That's where it's coming from, right? You can tell it's the shared ideas. It's the cultural stuff. It's ideas constantly, moving back and forth. And we know this computationally, right? By the way, right? Like, this is how categorically hard problems are solved, is you have to have a massive amount of information bouncing off each other. You have to have error correction. You have to have convergence. It's an optimization process. It's all about a lot of things coming together and eventually precipitating out the smart stuff, right? So Rogoff showing the difference between, the participation in society is what intelligence is. It's not this individualistic thing. You've got, Pierce, Bordeaux, for example, and he's saying, like, what society considers or sees as intelligence, again, is just an absolute social phenomenon. On and on. There's so many studies here, right? Wanger there's a Wanger study, Lave and Wanger, I believe. Again, getting back into the fact that it's participating in the community that's intelligent. You've got Clark studies saying that Clark and Chalmers that are saying that says intelligence essentially is like delocalized, right? Like it's in the tools, it's in the notes that we're taking, right? Tools, notebooks, it's on paper. It's not like, if you actually look at what smartness and problem solving and intelligence is, it's not something that's localized. It's not individualistic. It's very delocalized, and we externalize it in so many of the tools that we use. You can't just put it into the one thing or the one person. Joseph Henrich, right? So, saying, basically showing that, there's this generational aspect to intelligence. Like, it carries forward from the previous generations, and we pass it on from generation to generation. So even within a generation, it's not just like isolated in that sense. And then you've got Woolley, right? Showing that if you take a look at problem solving, Woolley and Malone study saying that, like, if you take a look at problem solving, it's a group phenomenon. Like, it's not an individual that's solving problems. Even if one person is doing it at one point in time, everything that they've learned, all the intelligence and the tools that they're using, you just can't disentangle it. It's an absolute collective phenomenon. Okay, so there's just a wealth of research out there that shows what I think is actually kind of obvious, that intelligence is just not rightfully considered an individualistic property. It just doesn't make sense. Okay, so New York Magazine comes out with an article. They say, the gifted program, maybe they don't make sense, and it's probably not a good thing. And if you look at the studies, they don't go on to be particularly eminent. And that makes sense, right? They don't have the eminence. They don't go on to be particularly successful relative to their peers. And then you take a look at the definition of intelligence in general, whether that's IQ or test taking. You can see the circularity there. You can see how it just completely blows out and doesn't really make sense when you actually think about intelligence and problem solving works. And then we take a look at the Einstein example, right? Quintessential example of a smart individual. And yet even saying that his intelligence is particularly individualistic itself doesn't make sense. He's massively embedded. And it's not just in the science influence. It's just science, non-science. It's just society writ large. And then you take a look at the decades and decades of research that show, intelligence is absolutely a social phenomenon. That's what makes the human different than the rest of the animals. We're extremely social. Everything that we've set up, like, just it demands and ensures a massive level of interaction between people. There's no idea in your head that is truly, truly original, because it's just so, it doesn't belong to really anybody else. There's no real belonging there. You can't show a root cause of it. Historians might like to do that. They like to tell those narratives, but it's just so massively embedded, it doesn't make sense. So what do I think about gifted programs after all that? Well, even just despite the data not really suggesting that they, unsurprisingly, I would say, go on to do particularly good things. The same thing with IQ, right? There's not a lot of evidence to suggest that high IQ people go on to do particularly great things. And again, the ones who do, it's a circular argument anyway, because good test takers get the better jobs, right? So the whole thing is just kind of goofy. But here's the deal. The problem, I would say, ultimately, with gifted programs is that you are separating kids away from the group. Now I hope you understand why that's a problem. The group is the intelligence. Okay? In fact, even if you notice a young child who is particularly precocious, they answer questions better, they seem, under whatever definition of smart, they seem to be smarter. That smartness is because of them being embedded. In other words, they might still be different, right? Like, they might be a better connector of information, because that's really what smartness is, if you think about it. If I come up with a good idea and nobody else came up with it, it's because I'm connecting ideas that nobody else is connecting. That's what it is. What else could it be? It's not coming from some magical force inside my brain. It's coming because I'm making connections that no one else sees. Einstein is considered smart because of the connections he's making. Well, what do you think he's making those connections from? The system he's embedded in. And it's not, and it's tempting to say, but if you separate the gifted child into an environment where the connections they could make are from like-minded peers, no, that's a fallacy. That's not true, because you can't really trace back the causes. Like, I was giving the obvious kind of non-latent scientific influences that any historian could easily pinpoint. Poincaré, the Mox, right? The Boltzmanns, like the kind of the obvious connections, the Riemannian, right? Riemann. Yeah, so obviously, but there's way more than that. There aren't even going to be scientific in nature, and we just can't disentangle it. We can't find the causal root. There is no root, right? Remember we were talking about the phantom traffic jams, right? I was using that example a few episodes ago, right? When you try to kind of put AI on the wrong path for drug discovery, right? There is no specific molecule. There is no specific root cause. That's because that's not how disease works, the ones that we're trying to solve. Again, the web of causality is completely diffuse. It's completely, there'll be hubs in the network, but those hubs don't mean anything once you extract them, right? Like if you go to a social network and there's an influence in there and say that person's famous or that person's smart or that person's successful, if you remove them from society, there is no success. There is no definition of it anymore. It has to remain embedded in the system. So if you take the gifted, so-called gifted child out of the environment where they are, by contrast, appearing smarter, you've destroyed the very thing that gives them the definition of smart. They need to be embedded. You don't know the better environment for them, right? Now, that's not to say that teachers can't give them harder problems, sure. And I don't see why that would be, that's not particularly administratively taxing. Like, I think if you're a teacher and you notice this kid excelling, you should have, if you're a good teacher, you should have the ability to give them harder questions. Quite frankly, you should be able to give them harder questions on the spot. I mean, as long as it's still within, I guess, the mandated curricula. Like why, right? If you're a good teacher, why can't you just give them harder problems, right? You shouldn't have to go to a book and find out no. Why are you teaching if you're not, capable yourself, right? So give them harder challenges, but don't extract them from the group. The group is the whole point. Even if they are as an individual smarter, it's only because they're making connections between the information that is present in the group. Take the organelle out of the cell. The mitochondria does nothing. It has no meaning. You can't put it in a better environment to be a better mitochondria. That makes no sense. It has to be in the environment. Okay? So give them harder problems within, but you want to give them harder challenges? Sure. Like don't purposely not give, if there's a kid who's solving all the math problems and he's bored, I'm not recommending, no, you just got to leave it like that. Right? If you're a good teacher, give them harder problems. How hard is that? Especially if you're talking about young kids. You're an adult. If you can't give them harder problems on the spot, I don't think you should be a teacher. Sorry. I don't see how that's an administrative taxing thing. Go ahead, give them harder problems. What I'm arguing is that don't extract them from the group of peers, from the other people who are supposedly less intelligent, which I would say is not the case, right? Intelligence is about making connections, and the things you have to be able to make connections to is the ambient environment of regular society. You don't know a better environment. That's a false narrative. The extraction is the problem. So I agree with the New York Magazine article, not the whole magazine. I agree with that article, and maybe I agree with them for reasons that they're not even thinking of, right? They're just pointing to studies, and yeah, I think it's worth looking at those studies, right? And you're right. I don't think the data it's just not enough. The data doesn't add up. What I'm saying is step back from the whole thing, almost at a meta level, and say, look, let's have the intellectually honest conversation about intelligence in general. It doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. The goofy little IQ stuff and the SAT score stuff, it just blows out. It only works in extremely refined, isolated environments that don't really have a whole lot to do with reality. And the reason why it blows out is because the notion that intelligence is individualistic to begin with is goofy. There's no way you can disentangle it from the environment. And we know that intelligence is a social phenomenon. That is what makes us different as animals. So the idea of gifted programs, removing kids from the environment that gives the notion of intelligence its very meaning, makes absolutely no sense. Okay, that's it for this episode. If you have any questions, jump onto social media, or better, jump onto Dekion.io and join the forum. $9.99 a month. You can join Dekion.io and the app I have on there for Science in Perspective, data visualizations about the concepts, study spaces you can use. You can explore things. You can chat with an Ask an Episode AI feature, so you can use AI to chat about the episode. The AI built into the system is very aware of what I talk about and what these episodes are about. Make cross-episode comparisons, get onto the community, ask questions, all kinds of stuff on there. Don't just stop here. Make this part of your lifestyle to be better and smarter in a collective sense. than you would be if you didn't join. Okay, so again, thanks everyone for listening and watching. Until next time, take care.